Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I just flew back into town from an event over in Los Angeles, and boy are my arms tired. They were showing off the new MSI Claw. They've got two different models. There's a 7-inch and an 8-inch model, and I got my hands on with it. Now, it's still a little bit early to make an impressions video about it, but it will be out in about a month or so, and so I'll make a video. I should be getting a review unit here pretty soon, and so look forward to more content about the MSI Claw here in the future. At the very least, I do think that they have taken a lot of the feedback they got from the first MSI Claw and improved it in many ways. It now has an 8-inch screen and an 80-watt-hour battery, and they're also using that new AI chip from Intel, which is supposed to be a lot more efficient. Now, this video is not going to be about the MSI Claw at all. I want to talk about the TrimUI Brick. I reviewed this about a week and a half ago, and I've just been playing it non-stop. I took it with me on this trip, and I've just done a lot of things to it, and so I want to talk about the overall software process that I've been going through. I found that the simplicity of this handheld works hand in hand with the simplicity of MinUI, which is a custom operating system. And it's very rare that we get such a good combination between both the software and the hardware, and it feels like they were made for each other. And so in this video, I want to walk you through all the little things I've done with the TrimUI Brick to make this an even better little console. And I bet by the end of this video, you will see the value in both this handheld as well as the software that accompanies it, because this is only one of many different ways that you could enjoy the TrimUI Brick. We got a lot of ground to cover, but I'll try to be as quick as possible. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. So let's start with a best case scenario. So I want to talk through everything that I've done so far and what my experience is now that I've set this all up. And this is using MinUI as our base operating system, then I've added a couple additions. For example, you can see here I have arcade and Neo Geo games. What I've done here is I've collected them all together into just one folder. And so you can see here I have, in addition to just arcade games, I've got things like 2020 Super Baseball, which is a Neo Geo game as well. So I can launch any of these games from this one menu. After that, we've got a bunch of Game Boy systems, but you might notice that I have Game Boy, then Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. So I have this in chronological order. Often when you load these up, it's going to be in alphabetical order, which means it's going to be Game Boy, then Game Boy Advance, then Game Boy Color. That always drives me nuts. And so I'm going to show you how to customize the order of all your systems within the MinUI interface. From there, we can scroll down to get to our home console system. So Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, TurboGrafx. So I put these all in a specific order as well. And of note, within the Sega Genesis folder, I have beyond Sega Genesis in here. I've also got 32X games like Afterburner Complete, but then I also have Sega CD games in here as well, like Eternal Champions. And so the Sega Genesis section is more like an umbrella that covers 3 systems, but again, I like to keep things really clean on my main interface. I've also done the same with TurboGrafx 16, so within here you will find TurboGrafx CD games as well. For example, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. And because both TurboGrafx 16 and CD use the same emulator, that's why I can put them in the same folder. They're going to launch in the same way. After that, I've got PlayStation games, and then I've also added native Pico 8, so I can go in here and then launch all of my carts. Also up top, we have our recently played list. So this is going to show all the games I've been playing lately, and then I can just launch them from here. This is really great if you're focusing on just a few games at once. And then finally, we have collections. So these are playlists that I've set up myself. You can see I've got a bunch of different franchises, and then I've added a bunch of games within them. So if we go into the Pokemon section, you can see I've got all the Pokemon games. So I can go through, and I put these in a specific order as well, so I can go through and play them as I want. And same thing if I go, for example, into the Sonic section. I've got them in a specific order, and so I can play through these as well. So it's really cool to be able to collect all these together. They're kind of like a favorites list, but I can curate them by franchise or by genre, whatever you actually want to do. Also, when playing a game, I've got a couple different setups here with the hotkeys. So I can toggle between the different aspect ratios here, and then I can also change the different grid overlays. So this is with no overlay, then I can use a scan line, and then also a grid. And so by default with Game Boy Color, for example, I have it set up to aspect ratio scaling, and then also this grid overlay, but I can quickly swap between them if I don't like that. I've also got it set up that if I press the R2 button, it'll toggle on and off fast forward. And so this is a quick way to get through role-playing battles and things like that. And then finally, I have it set up across the board where if I press menu and start, it's going to save and close out of my game and take me back to the menu. And so all that stuff is set up universally here on the system. And so that's the setup that I have with the TrimUI Brick right now from a software perspective. I have three major philosophies going on right here. The first is that I want to keep it light and simple. I don't want a really long menu list. That's why I've consolidated a bunch of systems into one. It makes it really easy to navigate through and then find the games I want to play. Secondly, I am focused on retro systems, so I've not added things like Nintendo 64 or Dreamcast. Those can play on the TrimUI Brick, but I think that it is a compromised experience. There's no analog stick on this device, and then also the back of it heats up, like I mentioned in my review, once you push it past PS1. So this is focused on PS1 and below. And then finally, I've set it up as an offline device. Now this does have Wi-Fi. You could go that route, but I found it to be too complex. So I haven't set this up with things like retro achievements or the ability to like play online with others or go into Portmaster and download ports of games. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible, and so I have taken this device offline. And my thinking about that is that because it is so small and pocketable, this is not a device I really play at home, but rather when I'm out and about. I can just throw it in my pocket and go outside and play it. And in those situations, I generally don't have Wi-Fi access anyway, and so I'm not compelled to get things like retro achievements. Instead, I'm treating this more like an old school console, like back in the day. And so when it comes down to it, this is not the only way to set up the TrimUI Brick. We have other operating systems like the stock one, as well as Newly is coming out soon. Those are going to give you more robust options. And if you want to get the most bang for your buck, be able to play as many systems as possible on this little machine, I would recommend going that route. But the goal of this little project that we're doing today is to make this super simple, to remove all those barriers, and so you can just get in and out of your games, which is, I think, where this thing really shines. So now I want to show you how to set up this software. It does take a little bit of work up front, but thankfully it's mostly drag and drop and then just configuring a couple files. And so I'll walk you through this process, and of course I'll have everything timestamped down below. Now I've made a full written guide on my website, and so you can walk through either this video or the written guide. They're going to be exactly the same. The written guide will be a little bit more detailed, and I'll also update it over time if new things come out. Now to start, you're going to need a microSD card. You can use basically any size that you would like, but I would recommend something around 64 gigabytes or maybe 128. All the cartridge-based systems, things like Nintendo and Super Nintendo, those don't take up much space at all, and so you can throw all those on a very small card. But if you plan on playing CD-based systems like Sega CD, TurboGrafx CD, or PlayStation 1, those will start to take up more space. Same thing with arcade games. Those can stack up pretty fast as well. And so I've personally been using a 64 gigabyte card, but you could go all the way up to 128. And thankfully, microSD cards are relatively affordable. You can find a 128 gig card from a reputable brand like SanDisk or Samsung for usually under $15. Now, if you do pick up a card that's over 32 gigabytes in size, then you are going to have to do one extra step, which is to format it to FAT32. Thankfully, this can be done on Windows and Mac very easily. In the written guide, I will have Mac instructions, but we'll do it quickly here in Windows because it's actually a little bit more complex. For this, we are going to need a special program or tool called Rufus, and I'll have all this linked in the written guide. So insert your card and then open up Rufus. And make sure under the device section that it's selected your card. You can see here mine is 128 gigs, so we are good to go. Now under boot selection, change this to non-bootable. And then also down near the bottom, you'll see file system. Change this to FAT32. In addition, if you would like, under the volume label section, you can give a name to this SD card. You can name it whatever you want. I'm going to call this one MinUI. After that, click on the Start button. It's going to ask, do you really want to do this? And you hit, yeah, man, I want to do it. It'll take a second to format, and now we are good to go. We've got a FAT32 file format 128 gig card. So now we're going to download all the files that we need to set up this whole system. The first place we're going to go to is MinUI, and this is going to be a GitHub page. Again, all this is linked in the written guide. From here, go down to the releases section, which will be on the right, and then go to the latest release and go to the assets section. In there, you'll find two zip files, one called base and one called extras. Download each of these. In addition to the official MinUI options, we also have an additional optional custom MinUI pack that we're going to use here in this video because it allows us to use certain emulators that I want to use. This is made by two developers within the community, both 10 levels as well as someone named Ryan M. Sarter. And this opens up dozens of additional emulators if you want to use them within MinUI, things like Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, Nintendo DS, and native Pico 8. For me personally, I'm most interested in setting this up with Arcade and Neo Geo as well as Pico 8, so that's what we're going to focus on in this video, but you don't have to stop there if you don't want to. And of note, this package from Ryan is totally optional, so if you don't want things like Arcade or Pico 8 or any of the other systems that this unlocks, then you can just skip it. Either way, the setup for this is also very similar. Just go to the latest release, and then under the assets section, you'll find the zip file. Just download that. And this one is a bit larger. It's over a gig, so it might take some time to actually download. Now, back on our computer, we have the 3 files that we have downloaded so far, the 2 MinUI ones and then the custom pack. So next, we just need to unzip each of these. And in Windows, the easiest thing to do is just right-click and select Extract All. And it's going to ask where you want to put it, and then just hit the Extract button. When it comes to extracting the official MinUI files, the base and extras one, these are pretty fast, like 30 seconds each. They're pretty small files. But the custom MinUI packs is a lot larger, so this takes a while to extract, about 15 minutes altogether. But once we have all of these 3 extracted, we can delete the original zip files. We don't need them anymore. And now we can move these files over into the blank SD card. So here's the setup. On the left side, I have my microSD card, nothing on it. And then on the right side, I've got my 3 extracted folders. Let's go into the base folder first. There are only certain things we need to move over from this one. So grab the folders that are labeled BIOS, ROMs, Saves, and TrimUI. In addition, grab the MinUI zip file, and then just drag all of these over to your SD card. Of note, within the base folder, there's a README file. You can use this to actually read through the entire MinUI installation guide. This is really just the video version of it with a couple additional add-ons. Once those have moved over, let's go over into the extras folder. We're going to grab everything here but the README file and then move them over to our SD card. Again, this might take a minute or two to move everything over and you'll be good to go. After that, open up those TrimUI custom mini packs and then grab everything but the README file and then move them over as well. And depending on your operating system, you might get a prompt to merge these 2 folders together. If you get that, just click yes. And because this entire package is pretty large, this will take a long time to move over as well, maybe another 10-15 minutes, so grab another snack and drink if you need it. And this is really the extent of the entire installation process. We have now moved over all of our MinUI files as well as these custom packs. And so we are now ready to start adding our own game files. That's going to include things like ROMs as well as our BIOS files. So on our SD card on the left, let's navigate over to the BIOS folder. And the unique thing about MinUI is that they have specific subfolders for each system. So your BIOS files have to go into the corresponding folder for that system. And again, here I tried to make it very easy for you. So on the written guide in the BIOS files section, I've just made a whole list of every single system, what folder it needs to go into, and the exact name of the BIOS file that needs to be added. Now, BIOS files, like game files, are copyrighted, so you're going to have to find them on your own. They're not going to be linked in my written guide. But at the very least, you can find the exact name that you need if you want to drag and drop them over into your BIOS folder. Now, when it comes to adding ROM files, it's a little bit easier. It's literally just adding your game files to the appropriate folder within the ROMs folder of your SD card. And you're going to find a pretty long list here. That's going to include everything supported by MinUI as well as its extras package, but then all that extra custom stuff that we added from Ryan as well. And again, here the process is very simple. You can open up the Game Boy folder, drag and drop your Game Boy files, and you will be good to go. But even though this setup is very simple, there are a couple things that I think are worth pausing and tweaking here so that we can really customize it. And this is a couple of those things that I mentioned earlier in the video. Let's start by talking about arcade games as our first example. You can see here that it's listed as arcade and then FBN in parentheses. There's a couple things going on here. Number one, this is indicating that it's using the Final Burn Neo core. And so if you are going to add arcade games here, make sure that they are supported by the Final Burn Neo system and not MAME. And the other thing worth noting is that basically anything with the parentheses of Final Burn Neo inside of it will also launch with the same emulator, and it doesn't have to be just this folder. For example, if you wanted to run Neo Geo games, you could run them if you have the Final Burn Neo versions. You can just make your own folder. So here I can make a folder called Neo Geo, and then in parentheses I can write FBN just like the previous one. And then once you add your games under the Neo Geo folder, when you open up MinUI, you're going to now see a Neo Geo section. You can go in and then launch your games. Now, I want to keep things as simple as possible, so I do not want to have a separate Neo Geo folder. Instead, I'm just going to rename my arcade folder and call it Arcade and Neo Geo. And then I've added all my favorite arcade games here, both my Final Burn Neo arcade games, your standard stuff like from Capcom, but then also my favorite Neo Geo ROMs. And so I basically consolidated my entire arcade arcade experience into one folder, which makes it super clean to navigate through. And like I mentioned before, I've consolidated other systems as well. For example, under the Sega Genesis folder, in addition to your standard MD files, which are going to be Genesis ROMs, I also have .32x files. That's going to be for Sega 32X. And then I also have some Sega CD games. These are going to be in CHD format. And so again, I've just kind of put these all together. I grew up with a Sega Genesis and a 32X and a Sega CD, and so I kind of like lumping them all together. Now, the way that MinUI works is if you add games to a specific folder, then and only then will it show up within MinUI. So if you don't put any games in these other folders, they're not going to appear at all. But what happens if you add games to a specific folder and then you decide you actually don't want to see it in your menu? Let me give you an example here with Nintendo DS. I've just added a few of my very favorite games here. Not a lot of Nintendo DS games are going to run well on this device because, after all, it doesn't have a touchscreen and you're going to have to swap between the screens all the time. And so instead, I've just added a few games here. Final Fantasy III, New Super Mario Bros., as well as Mario Kart DS. Those are games that I do plan on playing from time to time. However, I don't want to have an entire Nintendo DS directory taking up space in my main menu. Instead, I want to hide them and then put those games into a collection. And there's a pretty easy way to hide these folders if you don't want to see them. All you have to do is add an extension to them and call it .disabled. If you do that, these games are still going to stay there. They're still accessible, but they won't show up in the main menu. And when we get to the collection section, I'll show you how to access these games in a separate place instead of the actual Nintendo DS folder. Now, all the system really cares about is the system name in the parentheses, so you can change everything else to whatever you would like. So for example, with Sega Genesis, if you would rather call it Sega Mega Drive, you can just change that. It's still going to work. Just keep that MD within parentheses and everything will be fine. So as you can tell, there's a lot of customizability when it comes to the names of these folders and everything else. Now, the last thing I want to show you within these ROM folders is how to change the order of them within the MinUI interface. And this is very simple. You just add a numbering scheme to the front of the name. So for example, if I want arcade to be my #1 system in the list, then I can just add to the front of the name 0 and then close parentheses. And then for the next system I want to show in that order, I'm just going to give it the number 1 and then same thing, close parens. And so this is how you rename all of your folders so that they show in a specific order. You're not going to see these numbers when you navigate through the system. They're just going to be hidden. But this is the way that I got it set up so that I had Game Boy, then Game Boy Color, then Game Boy Advance. So that's out of alphabetical order, but it's in release order. And so there's a ton of options here. You can lump it together by Nintendo and Sega and Sony, or you could do it by all handheld systems, then all home consoles or CD systems, and so on. Either way, here's a quick look at the folder system that I set up for myself. Obviously, I'm not using every single system available within MinUI, but these are the ones that I plan on playing the most. Okay, next I want to show you how to set up collections. These are essentially going to be playlists that you'll be able to navigate through, like a favorites list. And these can be lumped together however you want. We're going to focus on just specifically franchises, but you could totally branch off. You could do things like role-playing games, your very favorites, or driving games. Whatever you want, it really doesn't matter. You can just access every single game in whatever list you would like. So to start, we're going to go back to the root directory of our microSD card and make a new folder. We're going to call it Collections with a capital C. And inside here, we just need to make a series of text files that are going to be our actual playlists. And to make a text file, it's very simple. Just right-click and then select New and then Text File. To start, name it whatever you would like. We're going to name this one Metroids because this is going to be a Metroid collection. And so this is the setup that we're going to use. On the left side, I have Notepad opening up metroids.txt. And then on the right side, I'm going to navigate through and grab all the names of all the games that I actually want to add to the playlist. Now, in addition to the actual name of the game, you have to do the entire path so it knows exactly where to find it. So let's start with the first Metroid game in our list, which is going to be the NES version. So I'm going to open up the ROMs folder, then I'm going to find the NES folder. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on it twice, but not a double click. So that way I can open it up and grab the text of the file itself. Now back on the text folder, I'm going to type in /ROMs with a capital R, and then another slash, and then I'm going to paste in the name of my NES folder. Now I'm going to go into the NES folder and find my Metroid game. Same thing here, I'm going to click on it twice, not super quick, but enough so that I can grab all the text. And then I'm going to grab the entire thing, copy that, and then paste that into the text file as well with a slash between the two. And so this is what the first game is going to look like. /ROM/NES folder /name of game. Now we can grab whatever game we want for our second game. We could do Metroid 2 for the Game Boy or Super Metroid. It's all going to be up to you. I'm going to go with Super Metroid this time around. So same thing here, I'm going to go back to the ROMs folder, find that Super Nintendo folder, and then copy the name of it. Now on the text file, I'm going to type /ROMs, capital R, then another slash, and then paste in the name of the Super Nintendo folder. From there, I'm going to go into the Super Nintendo folder, find that Super Metroid ROM, and then again, click on it, find the name of that file, and then copy and then paste that into the text file as well, with a slash between the folder and the name of the game. And really, that's about it. You just have to rinse and repeat until you've created your collection. You can add as many or as few games as you would like. So I'm going to kind of fast forward here through the magic of television, and here's a list of all the collections that I made. And it took me maybe 20 minutes altogether to kind of copy and paste all the names into it. But I have some really interesting things in here. For example, let's open up my Final Fantasies collection. And when I put this collection together, I was kind of obsessed about getting Final Fantasies 1 through 9 on the same system. And the hiccup here was Final Fantasy 3. I've basically got two options. I can get an English translation of the NES version, or I can go through and get the DS version. And I ended up going the DS route. So you can see within here, there is Final Fantasy 3 from my Nintendo DS folder. If you remember, this is a folder that we disabled, so Nintendo DS is not going to show up in the main MinUI menu. However, I pasted in the name of the folder, including that .disabled part of the file name, and so it is going to show up here. So this is a great workaround to be able to pull up games that may not be in any sort of file menu, but you can at least have it in your collection. So I don't really plan on navigating through my Nintendo DS catalog, but I wanted to have access to Final Fantasy 3 if I ever got to it, and so this is how I did it. I did the same thing with my Mario's collection, so I added in New Super Mario Bros. And then also Mario Kart DS. And you can also see that I arranged this collection in a specific order. So I have all the platforming games up top, and then we start going down into things like the kart games, and then we can move on even more to the sports games. And so here, again, you can organize your Mario collection however you would like, but this is how I did it. Okay, we've been doing a bunch of work and getting this all set up and tailored. We haven't even turned on the device yet, but I have one more thing that I want to do, so that way, basically, we never have to go back into this microSD card unless we want to add or remove a couple games. Now, what I want to do here is change out the boot logo of this device so that when you first turn it on, it can be whatever image you would like. If we go into the SD card and drill down into the Tools, then TG3040 folder, you're going to find a bunch of different apps that have been added to our device. And one of those apps is called bootlogo.pack. And this app will allow you to change out your boot logo. And by default, if we look at the bootlogo.bmp file, you can see that it's the MinUI logo. And so essentially what this means that if you want the MinUI logo, all you have to do is go into the tool section on your device, then launch this app, and it's going to change it out to this MinUI logo. But if you'd like, you can change this to basically any image that you want. All it really needs is a bitmap file, and you can use kind of any size you want to make it as big or as large as you want as the boot logo. So let's go ahead and swap this out. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename the old one so that way there's no conflict when I move the new one over. So I'm going to call this one boot logo MinUI just to make sure that I'm not deleting it and I can access it if I want, but it's not going to cause any conflict. Now I've already made my own bitmap file and I'll have it linked in my written guide if you want it yourself. And this essentially is just a logo that says TrimUI Brick, but it's using the Retro Game Core font and color scheme, so it's kind of a mix of the two. And again, you can make whatever file you want. This is just the one that I made, and if you want it, you can find it on the written guide. From there, it's just a matter of dragging and dropping this bitmap file into the folder, and it needs to be named bootlogo.bmp. And that's it. We are now done setting up our microSD card. Now you can eject it from your computer and then put it into your device. And we've got a couple other tweaks to do on the system itself, and we are ready to rock. Okay, so moment of truth here. We've done a ton of work to this microSD card, but we haven't actually put it in the device yet. So now we're going to put it in and then start up the handheld. And when you first start it up, it's going to say installing MinUI. This will take like a minute to go through the whole process. But once we've got it all set up, you can see that, yeah, everything is working great. First thing you may want to know is you can press the menu button and then you can do up and down with the volume key to change out the brightness of the system. And so by default, it's going to be really dim when you first start it up, but after that, you can change the brightness. And you can see that we have everything set up in order. So we've got our collections right here. We can go inside. We've got all of our collections and we can navigate through. And then we also have all of our arcade systems. So I can go through here and then I can play each of my games. And I've got Neo Geo and arcade games all put into one. From there, I've got Game Boy, then Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. So it's all in the order that we set up previously. Then we have our home console systems all set up as well. And then finally, we've got Pico 8. And then finally here at the bottom, we have the tools section. There's a couple things we're going to run here first. So the first is going to be that boot logo one that we talked about before. So I'm going to press this. It's going to flash a couple times and kind of give me this little bit of a wonky funky kind of setup, but then it should reset the system and we will see the new boot logo. And you can see right here, we got that little TrimUI Brick thing. Now it's going to start out really dim and then it'll get really bright. And that's just kind of how it goes with these boot logos. But either way, yeah, now we're back in and it will be that boot logo every single time in the future. In addition, this tool will self-destruct, as they call it, which means that it's going to disable itself after it's run. So you won't see it in the menu after that. And to get it back, it's going to be the same thing as we did with the disabled Nintendo DS folder. So you just need to remove that .disabled extension. The other tool I recommend running is this one here that says remove loading. This essentially will remove the loading TrimUI logo every time you start up a game. And so this is a really easy script and you can run it once and you'll be good to go. Another thing you may want to do is go into the clock section here, and then you can change out the time clock so that it will match whatever time that you're in. And this will help with certain games. I'm not really sure if this device has a real-time clock, but you can at least set the time here. So next I want to show a couple tweaks to set up those hotkeys that we were doing earlier. So I want to go through system by system and just show everything. We're not going to go through every system, but I'll give you the tools to do it yourself. So we'll start with Game Boy. So I'm going to open this up and then let's start with Adventure Island. Now by default, it's going to go right to the game. You can see it has some colorization to it. It's a little bit of a green kind of bluish tint to it. So let's press the menu button and see what things we can change. We're going to go down to the options section, and then under front end, I have a couple things I want to adjust. Now a lot of these have been pre-configured by MinUI, so you may actually like how they are set up. For screen scaling, you can see that it's set up with native or integer scaling. Personally, I prefer to use the aspect one, which means it's going to keep the 10:9 aspect ratio but blow up for full screen. For screen effect, you can change between none or scanline or grid. I like grid when it comes to Game Boy. And then under screen sharpness, there is crisp or sharp or soft. In general, I would recommend using crisp unless you have performance issues like with PS1 games or maybe some arcade games. Then you can change it over to sharp. But for something like Game Boy, this setup right here is not going to have any issues when it comes to performance. Same thing with CPU speed. You can change this between power save, normal, and performance. Game Boy, again, is not very demanding, so we'll leave it at power save. Now let's go back and then go into the emulator settings. This is where we can adjust things specifically to the RetroArch palette. So for colorization, you can see they're using internal, and then the internal palette is this pack. And then the pack number that they're running is this one, Pokemon Mini version. Now my favorite is actually this one, number 28, called the Game.com version. So we're going to change it over to this one. It's a little bit more green. Another thing you can change out here if you would like, under interframe blending, you can change this to simple. This is going to give a little bit of LCD ghosting to make it look more like an original Game Boy. And then finally here, under use official bootloader, you can see that it's disabled. If we turn this on, that means that if you've added the BIOS files, you're going to get the Game Boy boot logo. And so I'm going to enable this one as well. And then finally under shortcuts, let's make a couple additional changes. Now you can make shortcuts to whatever you would like here. You can use any sort of buttons that are not already used by the device, or you can use menu, this button right here, plus a combination of anything else like a RetroArch hotkey. So what I like to do for save and quit, I set this to menu and start. That way I can hit both of these and it's going to close out of the game and save it at the same time. So we're going to press A and then menu and start, and you can see there that now it's listed. I also like to set cycle scaling to the L3 button, which is this button right here. This means that as I tap it, it's going to go from integer scaling over to aspect ratio scaling and then full screen. Same thing with cycle effect. I like to make this one R3, so that means that I can change between scanline and grid or nothing. And then finally under toggle fast forward, I set this one to R2. That means I can press R2 at any time, like for example in a role-playing game, and it'll help me get through very quickly. And of course you can adjust any of the other ones as you like, but this is the setup that I prefer. For example, I don't like to use the save states thing here because I already have save and quit when I quit out of the game. Anyway, now that we're done, let's go into Save Changes and Save for Console. This means that every Game Boy game now will use all of these settings that we just set up. You could also do a save for game, like a per game configuration if you would like as well. Say, for example, you want to have special hotkeys or change out the button layout for a certain game. That's how you would do it. Okay, so this is the setup that I have now. I've got Game Boy with the special colorization, and then I have a grid overlay, but I can change that to be none, or I can change it to scanline, or then back to the grid. It's all going to be up to you. And then, of course, I can change the scaling. So I have it here with the aspect ratio, but I can go to full screen or native, and all of these are going to look great. And if we start up a new game, like like Castlevania the Adventure, it's now going to show the Game Boy bootloader, and that's because we added the BIOS files and we turned them on within the settings. And so there we go. We've got a pretty authentic experience at this point where I've got this nice colorization, I've got the grid overlay, and I can kind of just affect everything from there. Another thing worth noting, when we press menu and start, it'll save the game. And now the next time that we start up this game, we've got two options. We can press A to start it from the beginning, you can see there with open, or we can press X to resume the game. That's going to load our save state that we just saved. So if I press this, it'll take us right back to that title screen, which is where we were. And so the next thing you want to do is go system by system and then choose what you want to have in terms of settings for each of these. So you can have the aspect ratio scaling, you can change out like your scan line effect, you can set up your shortcuts, you can have the menu to start to be able to save and quit your game, all that kind of stuff. You have to do it one system at a time. It's a little bit tedious. This will take 5 or 10 minutes to go through each of them, but once you're done, you don't have to do it again. Now, one system that's a little bit different in terms of the shortcuts is going to be Sony PlayStation, because this one does use the L2 and R2 buttons in the games, and so you can't just use those as a toggle fast forward shortcut. At the same time, if you use the exact same shortcuts, like this scaling option here, it doesn't actually do anything other than just squish it down a bunch. So you probably aren't going to want to scale this at all. You just kind of leave it at the default settings. And so what I like to do here is I use this as my toggle fast forward button, and then I still have my scan line scaling right here as well, so I can change that too. And so these are the shortcuts that I use for PlayStation 1. I can still save and quit. I can now cycle my effect with the R3 button right here, and then toggle fast forward is up here instead. And the other thing worth noting with Pico 8 is I've set it up with the native app. So now I can go in and I can press this, and you'll see the little like explore colorful thing start up before the game itself starts up. So it's going to be running natively. And this will be great because it's going to really help when it comes to compatibility. Now, we still don't have internet access, so you can't use Explore or anything else like that, but you can still load up all of your carts and they'll run natively on here. But just note that the MinUI menu will not come up with this. So you can't set up hotkeys and stuff like that. Instead, you press start and you bring up that Explore menu. So you'll go down to shut down to close out of a game. And once you start playing games, you will find that the recently played list will start getting populated. So here are all the games that we were just playing just to set everything up. And so this will be a rotating cast. Now, before we end this video, I want to go over a couple tips and tricks to really get the most out of the TrimUI Brick with MinUI installed like this. First thing is, anytime you're in the middle of a game, all you have to do is just press and start the power button. It's going to do a quick save and then it'll power the device off. So now we've saved our game and everything is turned off. We'll be able to save battery life. Now, if we press and hold the power button again, it's going to turn the device back on. And in addition to loading up MinUI, it's going to go back into your game and the save that we were at as well. So it's kind of like a plug and play system. It also boots up fairly quickly. I think it takes, 10 to 15 seconds. So it's a pretty easy way to get in and out of your game. Now, another thing you can do is just use the sleep function. To do that, you just tap on the power button. It's going to put it to sleep. The lights right here are going to be a faint green, so you'll know that it's on. So we can just tap the power button again. It's going to come back from sleep. Now, the sleep function only lasts for about 3 minutes. After that, it will power the device off. And this is meant to help you save battery life. And when it powers off, it is going to save your game. So it's very similar to, when you press and hold the power button. Instead, it's just going to be a sleep button that'll last for about 3 minutes. And then it'll actually power down as well. So the sleep toggle is really if you're just going to do something quick. You got to answer a quick phone call or whatever, and then you want to get right back into your game. It's also worth noting that when in the main menu, if you don't press anything for 30 seconds, it's going to put the device to sleep. So it's going to go black like this, and then you'll have to press the power button again to bring it back up. And same thing here, it will actually turn off after about 3 minutes as well. So if you just happen to leave your device sitting there, it'll go to sleep after 30 seconds, and then after 3 minutes, it'll power itself off. So you're not going to drain your battery. And then finally, the last thing worth noting in MinUI is this toggle button right here is a mute function. So when you toggle it down like this, it's muted. And if I toggle it back up, you'll see the volume will resume, but if I toggle it back down, it'll mute. And so if you're ever playing and you can't hear anything, it might be because this is on mute. So something to keep in mind. But really, that's about it when it comes to the setup of this device. It takes a little bit of work up front, but I think this overall really simple interface is totally worth it. And it really is deceptively simple because you just really go in, pick out your game, and then start it up. And then you have all the tools at your benefit to be able to save your game, be able to power it off, make a quick save, go back into it, turn it into sleep, all those things that I would love to have on a little operating system like this. But we also have really fine-tuned it for ourselves. We've changed out, the order of our systems, what the names of each system are, and we've also gone into our collections and created all of these as well. And so we've just got a lot of things to work with, and that's one of my favorite things about MinUI with a setup like this. And we even made our own custom boot logo, and so it's really personalized this entire device. And so I think in the future, when it comes to, buying a little handheld for my friends and family, and I want to set it up for them, I think I will make them like custom MinUI setups. It's not as flashy as some of the other systems. We don't have box art or anything else like that. And it's also not pushing the performance as far as maybe some people would like be able to play Dreamcast on here. But personally, I think this is perfect for retro gaming. And this really is what I like about this device, is that it has this really high resolution screen, which makes it great for scaling systems like this. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm really enjoying this device. I love how small and compact it is. It's also relatively cheap. You can find it between like $50 and $60. And yeah, it's just got just enough power. All the controls are great and a beautiful screen. And so I think this is going to be a big hit. And I think everybody who's tried this out has really enjoyed it. And that's for a good reason. It's a really good handheld. And I hope that this operating system setup guide has just helped you to enjoy it even more, because this is the way I have it set up right now, and I'm really loving it. Now, I might try out some other custom operating systems in the future, but that's the great thing about these devices. I can just change out the SD cards. So I've got my MinUI setup. I can try out my Newly setup or MuOS if that ever comes to this device. There's just a lot of possibility here. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.